Welcome to today's video and welcome to the first of what is going to be an eyeshadow palette week here on my channel. So every day this week, Monday through Friday, I'm going to be posting a new video about eyeshadow palettes. I still maintain that eyeshadow and eyeshadow palettes are my favorite part of makeup. I've really come to love blush. Putting on different lipsticks is super fun. Testing and trying new foundations, I absolutely get a huge kick out of, but there's something about eyeshadow palettes that just calls to me. So I saw Samantha March and Allie Glines do a new eyeshadow tag video and I knew I wanted to do it. And then the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I actually had some other ideas that had been kind of kicking around for videos around eyeshadow palettes. And so I just decided to make a week out of this. I've never done a video every single day during a week before, so this will be new for my channel, but I will link those videos down below as they launch. So if you happen to stumble onto this video first and there's other ones out, those will all be linked down below. But today we're going to be tackling the tag video from Samantha March and Allie Glines. This was inspired by some of the TikTok videos that Samantha had seen, kind of just throwing out a tag or an idea around an eyeshadow palette and people quickly responding on TikTok. So she put together 13 different categories. Some of these I was able to pick something out very quickly and do exactly what I wanted to pull. And some others I had to think about. Like I had to open my makeup drawer and really look in there and think about what is the best fit for this question. The first tag is show us your newest palette. That honor definitely goes to my Sydney Grace Enduring Love palette. Now, this is not a new palette to the market, but it's one of those ones that has gone in and out of stock almost since the launch because everyone was very interested in this palette. She did both a light and a deeper version and deepened up some shades so they'd work better for tan to deep skin tones, which I think is kind of awesome. I've never seen a brand do that before with an eyeshadow palette and it's kind of genius. The shade that I'm going to reach for a transition shade is not going to be what somebody who is tan to deep is going to want. So I love that. This formula is everything you would come to expect from Sydney Grace. The mattes are incredibly rich and buttery, blend like a dream, and yet are super pigmented. The metallics and the foils are so intense, just absolutely incredible, and they blend really well with a brush or your finger. I really like eyeshadow palettes where I feel like I can get the same level of pigmentation and shine by using a brush as I do my finger. I did do a video with 7 looks using this palette. I will link that down below if you guys are curious about some of the looks that I came up with using this palette, but this is my newest palette and definitely one that is jumping way high on my list in terms of favorites. The next category is show your oldest palette, and I really had to think about this one because I have some palettes that definitely were launched earlier than others, but I wanted to take this through the lens of like what's physically the oldest palette in my collection. I still have the Urban Decay Naked palette. I still have the Urban Decay Naked 2 palette. Those came out way ahead of the ones I'm going to talk about. However, I repurchased those Urban Decay palettes, so they are still technically newer into my collection. So when I really looked at everything and I had to go online and kind of look at dates for launches of different things, the one that I realized was probably my oldest palette actually is from Urban Decay, and it is the Gwen Stefani palette. No doubt was super popular when I was in high school, and I just remember being so attracted to the whole aesthetic that Gwen Stefani was putting out. She wasn't afraid of makeup, she wasn't afraid of bold lips, she just was very playful and fun with her whole outfits and everything. And when this palette came out, I thought it was probably the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I still maintain this is one of the prettiest packaging that is in my collection. I just think it is gorgeous. It's very heavy and weighty too. Like it feels like a very high-end palette. The color story inside is very Gwen. Like if you look at the types of makeup she wears, she tends to be very natural with just some light shadow into her outer crease, and that is because she likes to wear a lot of bold lips. So I do feel like this is a palette that worked really well for me as somebody with very fair skin. There's definitely, I could argue, some redundancy in here. I didn't need quite so many light lid shades, but in general I had a lot of fun playing with this palette when I got it, and it's one of those ones that I haven't pulled out in a while, but even just swatching it for this video I was like, Yeah, see, you can just make some very easy classic looks. You do have some funky shades down here that are somewhat easy to incorporate. I've probably used the blue the least out of everything in here. That's probably the case of every eyeshadow palette that throws a blue at me. But yeah, in general, I don't know. There's something about this palette. I'm not somebody who keeps a lot of things around just because the packaging is pretty, but every time I go and do declutters for my eyeshadow palettes, I can't get rid of this. So the next tag was show your most expensive palette. So I decided to take this through the lens of what I've actually paid for a product versus what did it retail for, because there's a product that we're going to talk about actually in this video a little later on that when it first came out on the market had a much higher retail value, but I didn't pay that for it. So I decided to go with what I actually paid. And I don't have any of those big Natasha Denona palettes. I don't own any palettes that are over $100. I just haven't brought myself to pay for those. Like I just feel like they're not worth the value to me. I think the formula of probably a lot of those Natasha Denona palettes is top notch, but I just haven't been able to bring myself to pay more than $100 for an eyeshadow palette. I did break down and get this though. This is the Charlotte Tilbury palette that came out at holiday this year. This is her Starry Eyes to Hypnotize palette, and I really loved the color story in here. I liked that you had sort of bronzy neutrals here. You had more of your copper berries and pinks here, your sort of green gold, and then something that could really be a glamorous smoky eye here. So I felt like I had lots of warm and cool tone diversity. I haven't picked up any of her past holiday ones, and I haven't picked up the current Pillow Talk palette that's out in this form, but I will say the quality of the products in here are fantastic, far better than I think her quads have historically been. I have heard that the newer quads are more of this formula than what I had experienced with the past quads, so I'm kind of curious to see if some of the older quads get updated with this formula. But the formula that's in here, the formula that's in Pillow Talk, all feel very high-end and perform beautifully. All right, so next up is your most affordable palette. Now, I feel like everyone's been holding up those e.l.f. bite-sized $3 little quads that came out. I kind of gave myself a different filter to use for this video because I don't typically think of quads as palettes. Like, I don't think of my Charlotte Tilbury quads as a palette the way that I think of like this as a palette. I don't think of those bite quads as a palette, and it's semantics, right? If you consider 2 or 3 or 4 shadows a palette, that's totally cool. I feel like that's how everybody is thinking about these. I don't really tend to think of something as a palette until it starts getting more into that 5 or 6 shade range. Up until then, it's just like a duo or a trio or a quad, and I feel like once you move past quad, then you're a palette. So I've kind of taken that filter of like any products that I pick here needed to be 5+ shades. So when I looked at what I would consider to be a palette and then thought about my most affordable palette, I ended up with this one from Essence. This one is $9.99. It is got 9 different shades in here. It's very easy to work with. You've got a nice mix of warm and neutral shades in here, both from matte and shimmer formulas. I feel like you could make a lot of looks from light to dark in here. There's very easy like one shadow shimmer looks, which I'm always for. I'm always a huge fan of sort of mid-tone to deeper shimmer shades just all over my lid and blend it up through my crease and call it a day. This isn't the blackest black of life, but I actually kind of appreciate the fact that it's a bit more of a sheer black because I am not actually a huge fan of black eyeshadow. I find it to just overwhelm looks. And this one I don't feel like overwhelms, and I can use it to deepen up looks in here without it being going from like wearable to like, holy crap, you just put black eyeshadow and made a huge smoky eye. Yeah, this is a really nice palette. I feel like I've got quite a few other $10 palettes in my collection, but this one is the cheapest at $9.99. Okay, next up is the tag for your everyday palette. I am not an everyday palette kind of girl. I rotate through my Shop My Stash. I'm constantly like pulling things out of my drawers to just try different looks, or I'll put on a shirt and I'll be like, I feel like I want to wear a copper eye today, and so I'll go in and try and pick a copper eyeshadow. So I'm not somebody who has this like standby palette that I pull out every single day and like that's my palette. So I kind of had to think about this, and then there's a tag later on that says show your most used palette. I kind kind of had to think about those tags through the lens of, for me, around travel, because if I'm going to have an everyday palette, it's probably one of the ones that gets pulled for travel the most. And I also thought about it in terms of, okay, I just did this project for my Shop My Stash where I kind of pretended I'd lost all my makeup and thought about what palettes I wanted to repurchase first, and how would I build an eyeshadow collection again if I had to do it all from scratch. If you're curious about the products I picked for that project, I will link that video down below. But I had the luxury of kind of opening that makeup drawer and really thinking about, okay, what out of the ones that I've picked here, if I had lost everything else, would probably become my everyday eyeshadow palette. And for that lens, it actually ended up not being that difficult to pick the Persona Identity palette. I've seen a number of other people who are doing these tags talk about this palette in various reasons, but for me, I just feel like there's something very approachable and wearable about this palette. It still gives me some interest because you've got some plummy and some orangey looks, so it's not like perfectly neutral. And then it's got some really nice sort of coppery shades. You can do a very dark and smoky eye down here. One of my favorite shades in my eyeshadow palette collection is sort of this like grungy green gold shade here, which is Bombshell. I just think that shade is so, I don't know, there's something about that greeny gold that I just absolutely love. My kitty just came in and said hi. I don't know if you can hear her meowing. It sounded very loud to me. Anyway, the formula of the mattes is very easy to work with. The shimmer formula is just, it's very creamy. It just makes your eyelids look smooth. I've heard a number of other people kind of try and describe the effect of these eyeshadows, and they're not the most foiled eyeshadows in my collection, but there is something very lovely about them on the eyes. They give a very metallic finish, but they do it in a very smoothing way, and I just think it's one of the better eyeshadow palettes on the market. I do end up mixing this shade and this shade here to kind of get my perfect transition shade, because this in my crease just right out of the gate is a little too deep for someone as fair as me, but I just find that if I bounce my brush back and forth between those two shades, I get a transition shade that works for me. I have heard that as a complaint about this palette for people who are as fair-skinned as I am, but in general, I think it's a beautiful palette, and one that I definitely knew I would repurchase if everything had left my collection. Okay, number 6, show us your most colorful palette. I have to be honest, I'm not a huge brights colorful girl. I feel like the bulk of my brights are actually sitting in my single shadow collection, because most of the time when I'm thinking about, all right, I want a bright blue, or I'd like to try and mess around with an emerald green as a liner, or I'm really wanting to push the envelope with color, I think of my single shadow collection. And I didn't bring any of my single shadows kind of into play for this video. So I looked through my collection and I realized that I had kind of narrowed down the palettes I kept with my last declutter down to one colorful eyeshadow palette. And I've got palettes that have some color in them. I don't want you to think that there's like zero color in my collection, but I also feel like most of the colorful palettes I've kept are a little bit more muted. They have a little bit more grunginess to them as opposed to being brights. But this is kind of my one remaining brights palette. It's one that BH Cosmetics put out, I think last summer. It's their Weekend Festival palette. This was definitely one of the palettes that made me really fall in love with the BH Cosmetics formula and helped me realize just how fantastic their new formulations had been. I still maintain that the BH Cosmetics eyeshadow formula is as good, if not better, than ColourPop. I know that might be sacrilege to a lot of people out there, but their newer formulations are just incredible. I do think of this palette when I think like bright green. There is a duochrome in here, purple, that I absolutely love. I do like the fact that it's a decent mix of matte and shimmers, and I definitely can see putting looks together in here, because I also think there's enough neutrals in here to kind of deepen up something with a brown or run a rusty color into the outer corner, sort of have a nice sort of peachy shade, which is great for colorful looks kind of through the crease. So I do like this palette. It's why I chose to keep it, but I gotta be honest, I don't reach for brightly colored eyeshadows all that often. All right, so now we turn our sights to smallest palette, and I feel like once again a lot of people have been pointing to those little Bite eyeshadow quads that came out, and those are great. I love those. But I wanted to look at this in terms of, once again, 5 or more shadows, and I wanted to look at it in terms of pan size as well, because I was curious, like, of my smaller palettes, which ones have the smallest amount of eyeshadow in them. And I really came super close between the little mini palettes from Natasha Denona, which each shadow in here is 0.028 ounces. And then this little Tarte Pro To Go palette, which is at 0.03 ounces. So I feel like what Bite did was round up to the 10th decimal point at 0.03, and these guys took it out to the 100th decimal point at 0.028. I kind of feel like they're the exact same size. We're going to talk about these palettes in some future videos coming up this week. So ultimately, the one that I'm picking here is this little compact one from Tarte, and this is the Tarte Pro To Go palette. I really love this palette. I think it is like the perfect mix of shimmers and mattes. You've got 3 mattes here. One is a fantastic transition shade, a rusty sort of deepening shade, and then a perfect chocolate brown, and then you've got a copper, a berry, and a light champagne gold shimmer shade, and you can make a zillion different looks with this palette. The formula is fantastic. I've traveled with this an absolute ton. I like that it's compact. It's got this sort of soft touch cardboard packaging that I actually find is pretty shock absorptive when you've got it in a suitcase, so it's held up to like tons and tons of travel for me. Yeah, so I just think this is a fantastic little palette, and it is my pick for the smallest one in my collection. All right, so the next tag is show us the biggest palette in your collection. I greatly dislike large format eyeshadow palettes. I feel like most of them loses its cohesive color story or ends up with a ton of duplicate shades in order to slam 40 eyeshadows in a single palette. You end up with a lot of shades that look really similar on the eyes, and ultimately I just stare at it and I'm like, I didn't need 5 tones of brown here, narrow it down to 2, I would have been fine, cut this palette in half. And so I have honestly decluttered almost all of my larger format eyeshadow palettes. And so when I opened my drawer, I just didn't see a lot of like large format eyeshadow palettes. And honestly, what's left is this one from Marc Jacobs, which, don't get me wrong, that's not a tiny eyeshadow palette, but like in comparison to like something like the Festival palette from BH Cosmetics, it's not like completely jumbo sized. This is the palette I was referencing earlier that was technically more expensive when it came out than the Charlotte Tilbury palette. I think this retailed for $99, and if I remember correctly, I got like 35 or 40% off when I bought it. So it was somewhere around, more around that like 55, 60 range, I think, after, because I got it on sale after the holidays. I really like this palette though. Like, I just think the color story is so fun. The mattes are super blendable. It's everything I love in Marc Jacobs eyeshadow formulas. They're very soft and easy to blend. The colors in here are really fun. I think I've got a lot of pretty cool tones, but I've also got some warm tones in here, some really interesting sort of greenish shades here, mint and green shades. There's also 3 really pretty duochromes in here, and I am a huge sucker for duochrome eyeshadows. So I don't know, I really like this eyeshadow palette. It's one of those ones that every time I pull it out, I feel inspired. I don't feel like there's duplicate shades in here. I don't feel like there's anything that I would, you know, rip out, with one exception, which is this black shade down here in the corner. It's one of those mattes that has glitter particles in there, and I feel like I'm a broken record on how much I dislike that style of formula. But as I mentioned earlier, I also very rarely am reaching for a black eyeshadow, so you know, if they had left that as a matte black or put a black with shimmer in it, I'd probably be reaching for it the same amount of times, which is next to none. So yeah, I don't know, this was a fun palette, and it's definitely the largest one that is still left in my collection. Next up is show a palette with the best memory. And you know, I've got several palettes that have really great memories associated with them, but I have to go with the Urban Decay Naked palette, the original one. Now this is a new version. I bought this right before they discontinued it when it was like half off, so it looks like it's not super well loved, but in reality, like I said, it's pretty new into my collection. I wore this palette on my wedding. I wore the two matte shades. I put Naked here all over my lid and then just added the slightest amount of contour with this shade. And then I did a little bit of a black liner and lots of mascara because I wanted to wear a bold red lip. I knew with that decision to wear a red lip that I wanted to keep the rest of my makeup looking very fresh as opposed to super made up, because most brides, I feel like, go with a choice of like a nude or soft pink on the lips, and I kind of turn that on its head, and so I didn't want my eye makeup to be overpowering. I wanted the lip to be kind of the show that day, and I don't know, I just have really fond memories of getting ready with this. And then quite frankly, this is the palette that like was incredibly relevant in my life for so many years. When this came out, it was such a game changer in terms of eyeshadow. I had been wearing lots of MAC singles and like MAC holiday palettes. Like that was my primary makeup, my primary eyeshadow, along with I think some, I don't know, maybe Revlon quads if I remember correctly. And when this came out, it was all I wanted to wear. It was all anyone was talking about. I remember feeling like so luxurious and bougie picking this up and then just using the absolute heck of it on a regular basis. And then when the Naked 2 came out, I was like giddy. And so those two were like my mainstay palettes for like years and years and years. So I just have such fond memories of this, and I personally think this still holds up. I absolutely love the color story in here, and I like that it's more neutral as opposed to warm the way that I felt like so many eyeshadow palettes have gone lately. So yeah, just lots of good memories with this palette. Okay, so next up is show a palette worth the hype. I definitely feel like eyeshadows get hyped. I mean, we could argue that this was hyped and I still really like it. But the one that I still feel like, I think it was that I saw this palette talked about on Trend Mood, and I remember seeing the pictures and being so excited for it. Like, oh my gosh, this is the palette I've been waiting for from this brand. And I remember reading the comments down below and they were all like, boring, who in the heck would want this? Like, it's like every other palette we have in our collection. Like, nope, who asked for this kind of thing? And I remember being like, I am so excited for this. Why is everybody else not excited for it? And it came out, and then I watched everybody talk about it and talk about it and talk about it. And now I see people still talking about it. And I think for good reason. It's the Sultry palette from Anastasia. I think this is the best palette that she's ever done. I know that are bold words because I know Modern Renaissance was such a shake-up palette for the industry, really launched the warm trend in a meaningful way, and I love that palette. And I could honestly probably put that palette in this place as well because I do think it's worth the hype, and I think it was incredibly hyped. But something about this palette just, it's amazing to me. I think that everyone points to this as a cool tone palette because they see, you know, a cool tone gray, and you see this sort of taupey transition shade here. And then I could argue that this is sort of a cool toned taupe. But really, when you swatch this palette, and hopefully you can see this here in the swatches, these are very neutral shades. Not a lot of these are super cool tone leaning. A lot of these are true browns, true golds, a neutral pink. You've got a warm khaki and a warm sort of coral shade in here. So I would argue there's as much warmth as there is cool, and in general this palette is very neutral. Shadows are so multi-dimensional. The shimmers and the tiny glitter particles that are in these shadows are very multi-dimensional, and every time I make a look out of this palette, it just turns out fantastically. Like, this is the palette I almost always reach for when I want to kind of amp up my look to go out somewhere. So I love this palette. Oh, and this shade Cyborg, which looks very just like a silver in here, has this like, I don't know, there's this like taupey, there's just like this purpley taupiness to it. It's not a pure silver, and that shade I just think is so cool. Like, it's so much more than I expected. I was expecting a true bright silver, and so to get that Cyborg shade to be this like taupey lavender type shift to it, I don't know, it just made me fall for it. So definitely would put the Sultry palette in the worth the hype category. Okay, palette not worth the hype. This is one that is actually no longer in my collection. It exited when I did my last eyeshadow palette declutter, but the palette that comes to my mind is the Too Faced Chocolate Bar palette. I felt like there were people that fell in one of two camps. You either loved the Urban Decay formula and loved the Urban Decay Naked palettes, or you didn't care for those and you liked the Too Faced ones instead. I definitely was more drawn to Urban Decay than I ever was Too Faced. I just didn't like that whole like super girly, slightly kitschy style of Too Faced has just never been my, I don't know, it's never been something that really attracted me. I liked, especially old Urban Decay, like I felt like they were edgy and interesting in a way that, you know, there just was a little bit more cool factor in my mind to Urban Decay than there ever was to Too Faced. And so as a result, I had all the Urban Decay palettes and just kind of never was interested in the chocolate bar palettes. I ended up picking them up and I just never really got on with them. I always felt like my looks almost always looked the same. There were always 2 or 3 shades in the palettes I owned both the semi-sweet and the original, and there were always 1 or 2 or 3 shades actually in all of the palettes that just didn't perform. Like they were hot garbage. Like when you go and look at them out on Tim Talia's website, she gave them like Fs. And I remember being like, well gosh, like I don't feel like I have any F shadows in my Urban Decay palettes. There are shadows that I reach for less than others because I don't always do a, you know, charcoal smoky eye, so I'm not reaching for that charcoal shade a ton, but it performs. Like it's not like the shadows don't perform. And I just felt like there were too many shadows in those palettes that just didn't perform. Like that's something that always stuck out in my brain. And then I just felt like the shadows were just, they were mediocre at best. The mattes were fine. The shimmers were okay. Like I felt like I always had shimmers that were way better in other palettes. And I still maintain that I like the shimmer formula in the Urban Decay palettes a heck of a lot better than I like the shimmer formula in the Too Faced palettes. So like I just never understood the hype of those palettes, and I still hear people talk about them like they're their favorite palettes, and I just could never reconcile that in my head. All right, so question 12 is show your favorite palette from a favorite brand. I am actually going to skip this one because I'm going to make a whole video about this. So I have thought about what are my top 10 favorite brands. Not eyeshadow brands, but just brands in general. And then I have picked my favorite palette from those brands. And so that is a video that is going to be coming out later this week. So rather than slop this question in here, I'm going to skip it and we'll do an expanded whole video about this idea here coming soon. So that kind of brings me to number 13, and this is your most used palette. Now, technically, I would say probably the Urban Decay Naked and Naked 2 palettes were the ones who have historically had the most use, but I have repurchased those palettes more recently, so they look really bright and shiny and new, and so they're not currently the palette in my collection that has had the most use. And when I think about this palette, I really feel like the honor has to go to the Tartelette Bloom palette. This palette, kind of along with the Persona palette, but even more so this palette because I've owned it longer, has been literally everywhere with me. It has been all the way to South Korea and back multiple times. It has traveled with me to Vegas for conferences. It has just, it's definitely my most traveled palette as well. This palette definitely shows the most use. The tart part on these eyeshadows is completely worn away, and they all show really big divots and really good wear. And you know, it's interesting, I've had this palette for a while now and it's still, I open it up and it still has this lovely like vanilla chocolate scent that is very pleasant as well. So, and this has also been a great travel palette because it does have a mirror. So if I get into a hotel where the lighting is horrible in the bathroom, having this palette be able to like, I prop it up on some books or something and I can get ready with this giant mirror in here has been very nice. So that is the most used palette in my collection. Okay, so that wraps us up for the eyeshadow tag video from Samantha March and Allie Glines. Their videos are linked down below if you want to watch them. And I will also link some of the content creators I've seen do this and their answers. It's been very fun to watch so many different people I love and follow do this tag. So I will link some other videos down below if you guys are curious about how other people are answering these tags. I hope you guys are having an amazing day. Make sure to tune in tomorrow for the next eyeshadow palette focused video for Eyeshadow Palette Week. Talk to you soon. Bye.